Now, another interesting looking at the historical record is that as the Spanish, as the 72 Spaniards come up and create Mission de Valero and the Presidio, um, one of the diaries in 1718 says, "Today and all other days we traveled from the Guadalupe Ford downstream. We have seen many tracks of cattle, and we thought that they were bison tracks, i.e., buffalo tracks, until today, until 5 o'clock in the afternoon when we saw a Castilian bull. From this, we realized that the livestock was cattle." So, what's interesting is that cattle now have become part of the abundant wildlife of the San Antonio region. And when I'm talking about abundant, I'm talking about bears are up here, deer, turkey. You could fish in the streams. There was in the San Antonio River. It was often deep enough that you could fish into it. It was a real, if you're a hunter or a naturalist, it was a real paradise. But as part of the natural world of San Antonio, the Spanish, as they come and they settle it in 1718, they also discover that there are cattle up here. That and they actually, for decades they'll actually hunt the cattle in the same way that they would hunt deer, there because they're feral. So how did cattle get to the San Antonio region? Well, it's actually pretty simple. The Castilian cattle that the Spaniards encountered as they came into the San Antonio region were the descendants of the cattle that the Spanish had brought up in the 1690s before they'd retreated back into back across the Rio Grande after the disastrous attempt of the Spanish to try to create missions in the East Texas area in the 1690s. So what we think now is that it seems like all the evidence points to the fact that the cattle found the East Texas area all the way down into San Antonio and now what's Goliad. They found this a very friendly place for them in the sense that there was enough food here. They didn't seem to have as many natural predators coming after them. And so, one of the legacies, interestingly, of the 1690s expedition, one of the permanent legacies, is that as they retreated, they weren't able to take all their cattle with them. They really got the hell out of Dodge in the 1690s. They couldn't get away fast enough. And they're being followed by the cattle who want them out and who would kill them if they stopped for too long. So what we now know is that the beginning of serious cattle growth, the growth of cattle in Texas during this time, comes from the 1690s expedition. These cattle are wild, they're feral, and as the Spanish come up 20 years later, 25 years later, there they are. And again, so what we're starting to see here is the beginning of what would be the major business of Spanish Texas, which was ranching, horses and cattle, and to a lesser extent, this was more in South Texas, sheep and goats. Okay, so San Antonio was founded. San Antonio was founded 1718. You have missions in East Texas that have been established. Los Ideas is established near Natchitoches, Louisiana. So the Spaniards finally have a very, very tenuous hold on Spanish Texas. And again, don't forget Hidalgo and San Juan Bautista and his role in this. If he hadn't created that San Juan Bautista as kind of this infrastructure, it's kind of this gateway to Spanish Texas, none of this would have happened. So we have to give him credit. Okay, so things are very shaky for the Spanish. It's easy to say they created missions and presidios and forts. And then you might think, oh, well, that they were really powerful and that these soldiers were very well armed and well trained and this and that and the other. Nothing could be further from the truth. Initially, the presidios were they were made out of wood, they were stockades, they were poorly constructed. The soldiers that came up here were not necessarily the best soldiers that the Spanish had. You would have not come into Texas unless you were pretty desperate, or unless you were ordered to come into East Texas, or Texas in general. Um, because it's so remote. It's really dangerous up here. Folks in Mexico, they want to be in Mexico City. They want to be near the major cities. They don't want to come up here. I say, and historians say, well, they founded missions and presidios and this and that and the other, and everything was hunky dory. That's nothing could be further from the truth. These were very, very tenuous settlements. The Spanish are just barely holding on, and evidence of this is an episode which happened in 1720, and it's called the Chicken War. And the Chicken War is one of those dumb things that you're going to have to know for a quiz or a midterm, so make note of it. Here's what the Chicken War is all about. The Spanish and the French, as hopefully you've guessed by now, were major rivals, not only on the Texas-Louisiana border, but in North America and also globally, in places like India, in places, parts of Africa, parts of the Pacific area. So the Indians, the Spanish and the French, they're playing for very, very high stakes. And the area of East Texas is a very minor cog in what's really, you could argue, a global war, one of the first global wars. And that's what happens in the early 1700s. There's a global war that breaks out between powerful European countries, and Spain and France are on different sides of this war. And one of the very, very minor incidents in this war, although it's important to Texas history, was that a small group of French in I think it's 1719, something like that. It's a year or two after the founding of San Antonio. They go to one of these missions that have been established near Las Ideas, and remember, these are very rudimentary. They're wooden. They're just kind of they're poorly constructed. They're not very safe at all. A small group, probably less than 10 French soldiers, um, go to a mission to capture it. Their part, they want to do their part in this global war. And so they go to the mission. Remember, the Los Ideas is only like 13 or so miles from Natchitoches, Louisiana. And they capture this mission. And there's a brother at the mission and a couple of Indian converts. It's only a couple of folks. They flee. This is not a very bloody encounter. And the reason why we call this the Chicken War is that the French and his soldiers, 7 or 8 soldiers, they gathered up the sacred vestments that the Spanish had left, and then they raided the hen house. And as they left Las Ideas, the mission there, they left with a bunch of chickens that they had stolen, and they took off back to Natchitoches. So the Chicken War is kind of a silly name for a minor incident in a global struggle. Okay, but it's important for Texas for this reason. The Spanish retreat. They just skedaddle out of East Texas after this incident. And there weren't even that many Spanish to begin with. There were probably less than 100 in the East Texas area. Las Ideas is abandoned, and the Spanish take off. And this had happened once before. Remember, 1690s, the Spanish had taken off from East Texas. But things are different by 1719/1720. How are they different? Think about it. Now there's San Antonio, which is, and there's further back, there's San Juan Bautista. So the Spanish have established what you might say is some strategic depth in Texas that they didn't have in 1690s. They'd established a logistical infrastructure in Texas. So when the Spaniards skedaddle from Las Ideas and from East Texas, they don't go all the way back to Monterey now. They don't even go back to San Juan Bautista. They go to San Antonio. So this is significant because what this will allow the Spanish to do, it's going to allow them to regroup after this defeat. So the Chicken War is kind of a silly name for a minor incident in a global war that will have big implications for Spanish Texas. And it also shows the ability of the folks in East Texas to go to San Antonio, that the Spanish now have laid down, like I've said a bunch, an infrastructure in Texas that had not existed until this point. So in some, after the Chicken War, the few Spanish that are in East Texas, they abandon their posts, they abandon Las Ideas, but instead of going deep into the interior of Mexico, they are able to go to San Antonio and regroup and wait for what the Spanish government, how it's going to react to this event. And one of the things that you should realize now is that whenever anything happens on the Texas-Louisiana border, the Spanish government sits up and takes notice. They're super, super, super sensitive about the border between French Louisiana and Spanish Texas. And now, once again, they've been driven out of the border by this small force of Frenchmen. So you can bet now that the Spanish government is going to do something, because the rule of thumb of the Spanish period is when Spanish officials in Mexico City or Madrid, when they felt that Texas was threatened, they poured resources into Texas. When they felt that Texas was safe, they took away resources from Texas. But this is one of the instances where they feel Texas is threatened. So the Spanish government in the early 1720s is going to start pouring resources into Spanish Texas due to the loss of East Texas during the so-called Chicken War.